There we go. Welcome back, guys. Again, this is Lordy, your lecturer for psychological testing and assessment. For today's video, we'll be talking about test validity. I believe most of you went through the lecture about the different estimates of reliability. But for today, let's focus on the different estimates or measures of test validity. Okay? I hope everyone who's listening on the other side of this recording to understand the meaning of validity, apply the different measures of validity, and at the same time, identify how practical is it to use a certain test, okay, through the different psychometric properties that we've talked about so far. Okay, so what are we waiting for? Let's establish the definition of test validity. When we talk about test validity, it's actually how well a test measures what it purports to measure. Okay? It's how the test measure a certain variable that it claims to measure. And most validity estimates are actually under the responsibility of the test developer that before they decide to publish the test materials that they've developed, they have to make sure that most of these estimates that we'll be talking about right now are well established. Okay, so that we can say that these tests that we are about to use can really measure that variable of interest, no, that we want to measure. Okay, so what are the different measures of validity? Let's start with one of the most superficial form of validity, known as the face validity. When we talk about face validity, it's actually how a certain test, no, appears to measure what it purports to measure based from the eyes of the test takers themselves. Okay, actually there are some references who claims that when we talk about face validity, it does not really talk about validity, but it's more of getting the trust, no, or establishing a relationship, establishing trust or relationship with your test takers. Okay, so again, there are a lot of references who claims that face validity is the most superficial estimate or measure of validity, but it's still considered or discussed to be a measure of validity. But aside from face validity, there are actually a more rigid and acceptable measure of validity that we can use to make sure that the tests that we are about to administer are very much applicable to the variable that we want to measure. And that would actually lead us to the measure of content validity. If face validity asks about how the test takers are agree, no, that these certain tests measure what it purports to measure. When we talk about content validity, the agreement should actually come from the subject matter experts. It doesn't just come from the test developers themselves, but it would be coming from other academicians, experts, scientists who are also in the field of study. Okay, for example, you want to measure anxiety, then you would be collecting responses, suggestions, no, coming from experts about anxiety. It may be coming from a psychology practitioner, a psychiatrist, no, and of course other individuals who are researching, practicing on how to assess, measure, and even treat anxiety. Okay, so it's basically defined as a measure that estimates how adequately a test sample behavior is a representative of the wide universe of behavior, no, that the test was designed to sample or measure. Remember, when we are administering a certain test, it assumes that it is measuring an individual's sample behavior. Okay? And that's what content validity is trying to address here. So coming from the different subject matter experts, we'll be asking them to evaluate the test itself, no? Agree whether they think a certain item should be included in a test or express their disagreement, no? Or maybe recommend certain forms of revision so that it would turn out that the test that was developed would now measure the variable of interest that we want to measure. We would usually make those decisions after acquiring this ratio, the content validity ratio. Okay, that would be coming from our subject matter experts. Okay, research suggests that in order to retain a certain item, it should have at least a content validity ratio of 0.62. But having a higher content validity ratio among the different experts, no, or coming from the evaluation given by the experts, would be ideal as well. Okay, like for example, if it's higher than 6.62, then that would give us an idea that it's a good item to retain. Okay, so that's it for content validity measures. The next measure is known as criterion validity. Okay, when we talk about criterion validity, it asks whether a certain measure estimates a certain variable of interest at a current time or can be used to predict future behavior. Okay, so it measures how adequately a test can be used to infer an individual's probable standing in a certain measure of interest, variable, or criterion. Okay, so these are some of the characteristics that we want to establish if we are to measure criterion validity. First, it would be its relevance. Of course, whether a certain item or test is applicable to the matter that we want to explore, measure. Okay? Next is that it's supposed to be valid as well. That it is, again, a measure of that variable that we want to estimate. Okay? And the third characteristic is that the thing or the test that we are about to use can be claimed as a test that cannot be contaminated. It means that there would be no other variables or extraneous variables that would affect how a certain test estimates a certain variable or measures a certain variable of interest. Okay? So these are the evidences for criterion validity. If we have the content validity ratio for content validity, for criterion validity, we have concurrent validity and predictive validity. Okay, when we talk about concurrent validity, it talks about the degree to which a certain test score agrees to a certain criterion as measured by another test or measure. So usually it can be established by correlating results from two tests that measures the same variable. Of course, the reference test should be considered as a test that is also highly valid, okay, or that is accepted to be the gold standard of measuring a certain variable that we want to measure as well, based on the tests that was newly developed. Okay, so that's concurrent validity. Again, we can claim for concurrent validity when test B serves as a validating criterion for test A. Okay, which could give us an idea that yes, these new tests that we are currently developing is also applicable, can be administered, scored, and interpreted if used for this target population. Okay? Another evidence for criterion validity is known as the predictive validity. Again, as we talked about criterion validity, it doesn't just talk about how we can use the measure right now, but it also talks about how we can use that measure to predict future behavior or future outcomes. And that's the purpose of predictive validity. Okay, it gives us an idea how a certain criterion that we are measuring right now can give us an idea about the person's future performance, behavior, or maybe the progress that they may encounter along the way. Okay, we usually evaluate predictive validity using the base rates, hit rates, and miss rates. Okay, when we talk about base rates, it talks about the overall probability of having or achieving a certain characteristic or measure. Okay, we'll be establishing that, of course, to the test that we are about to administer and predict whether these certain criterion, if met right now, can lead to a certain form of development. And if it indeed hit, then that now can be termed as hit rate. But if not, then that now can be categorized under the miss rates. Okay? So of course, it would need a lot of time, study, to establish these evaluative procedures for predictive validity. It would at times require us to do a longitudinal study before we can arrive at a conclusive result. Okay, so these are our evidences for criterion validity. Then other factors that we may want to consider would be, of course, the validity coefficient. That's basically related to how we expect other coefficients that we might find in testing the different psychometric properties. Of course, we expect this validity coefficient to be high in order to claim that our test, no, or the test that's being developed is highly valid, and it can guide clinicians, scientists, researchers to arrive at a certain conclusion and decision. Okay. Other factors that we may want to consider is our knowledge about the possibility of having an incremental validity. It talks about the degree to which we can consider, no, another predictor that can affect the measure that we are trying to establish. Okay? And the last one, factor that we might want to consider in establishing criterion validity is through the use of expectancy table. Okay, so we would be talking about different expectancy tables later as we try to explore test utility. Okay, it just gives us the idea how many people, no, could hit the target, for example, for predictive validity, and how many of those tested individuals missed that target. So that can be utilized to establish predictive validity as well. Okay. So the last estimate or measure validity is known as a construct validity. The reason why it was discussed last, because it is considered by many researchers to be the unifying concept of validity. Okay, it's described as the appropriateness of inferences drawn from the test scores that we've collected regarding an individual's standings or measure about a certain variable or construct. Okay, so basically, it's how we see validity as a whole, how a test measures what it purports to measure. Okay, so we have a lot of evidences for construct validity. The first one is test homogeneity. Okay, it's actually easier for us to establish test validity if we can develop a test that measures a single construct, a single concept, okay, and include as many items as possible that could represent that concept or variable that we wanted to measure. Okay, we could also establish construct validity as we observe it to change through the different age range. We know that there would be certain variables, concepts, or constructs that changes across different timelines in our life. No? And if those measures that we've conducted do really change as measured by the test that we've developed, then that can be considered as an evidence of construct validity. Okay, so usually this would really ask us or require researchers to do a longitudinal study so that we can establish, no, how each of these constructs change across time and how our measure goes through or goes with that change. Aside from longitudinal research, cross-sectional research can also be considered as an option, no, for a quasi-experimental approach in order to establish these evidence of construct validity. Okay? Another evidence of construct validity is through pre-test and post-test changes. Okay, we know, for example, in a true experimental design, we often conduct pre-tests, expose a set of individuals or the sample that we want to, the experimental group, no? The sample that we want to expose to a certain treatment and then conduct post-tests. Now, we expect usually as researchers that that kind of treatment would either improve, for example, a certain characteristic or would minimize a certain unwanted characteristic. Okay? And upon establishing those changes, no, upon comparing the pre-test and post-test results, then that could serve as an evidence of construct validity. No, as we use the test or measure that we utilized for both time frames wherein we are about to administer them. For example, during the pre-test and during the post-test. Okay, of course, we'll be using the single test So that would give us an idea how construct valid that test is, because we can observe the changes that occur whether towards the higher end or towards the lower end during the pre-test post-test procedure. Okay. Another evidence would be the existence of difference between distinct groups. We know that there are certain psychological concepts, constructs, measures that could differ across different ethnicities, races, no, majority versus minority groups. Okay, and upon administering a certain test or measure to these varied groups, we expect them uh, to result, no, or to give us a result that has certain differences, okay, based on their ethnicities, race, or other group divisions. And that could really serve as an evidence for construct validity. Okay, so last two evidences for construct validity are most likely the two commonly encountered evidence for construct validity. We have there the convergent evidence and the discriminant evidence. When we talk about convergent evidence, it's actually how we compare and relate the results that we've gathered from the test that we are testing to the other sources of information. Remember, if you can remember the different sources of data in assessment, it doesn't just come from a test, but it should come from live report data, observer report data, and even self-report data. Now, if the test results that we'll be coming up with using a certain measure will agree to those informations that were collected coming from the other sources of information, then that could establish a convergent evidence. Okay? There are also certain researchers who use convergent evidence to correlate a certain set of tests to other tests that claims to measure the same construct or variable. Okay. On the other hand, when we talk about discriminant evidence, it talks about how our measure or the test that we are trying to establish, no, generates a result that does not correlate with another test result that claims to measure a different variable, construct, or concept. Okay, so for example, the test that we are trying to develop or the test that we are trying to criticize, no, its construct validity wants to measure anxiety, but another test that we'll be using to establish discriminant evidence is a measure of maybe interest, no, about a certain activity. Then it's basically measuring a different concept. So if ever we'll be correlating the two results, then there should either be low or insignificant correlation between these results. Okay. Yeah. So most of the time we'll be using the factor analysis or multi-trait, multi-method matrix. Okay. So this is actually where we can encounter terms such exploratory factor analysis. Usually it's being done, no, as the first step in establishing these evidences. Then after that, we'll be progressing to a procedure known as confirmatory factor analysis. We can either use orthogonal rotations, no, which does not assume that it could allow correlation between the different measures that we used, or oblique rotations that assumes or allows correlation between those measures. Okay, those highlighted words that are included on each back are just examples of the different types of each rotations. We have the varimax, quartimax, or equimax under the orthogonal rotation, and the direct oblique or the promax rotation under the oblique rotations. Okay, those are just more terms that maybe you may want to explore, no, as you venture or as you prepare for the psychometrician or the psychologist board exam. Okay, so let's move forward towards test utility. It's actually an adjunct psychometric property that we can also use to determine whether it's practical to use a certain test, no, or is it still useful for a certain purpose. Okay, so when we talk about, again, test utility, it talks about how useful or practical a test is, so that if ever we could identify it's not that useful or it's not that practical, we can look for an alternative test that could guarantee usefulness and practicality. Okay? So basically, the psychometric property is established through the first two psychometric properties of test reliability and test validity. Okay, these are some of the factors that you want to consider. Of course, psychometric soundness, how reliable and valid the tests are. You have to consider those things first. It's costs. Okay, so we know that those highly standardized tests comes with a cost. Okay, it may range for around, for example, in Philippine peso, I'm not sure, but if my memory serves me well, and based on my experiences, pinakamura is parang nasa around 10 or 15K, no? And it could actually reach an amount of 100 or even more than 100K if you want to buy those highly standardized tests. And of course, its benefits, the profits that we could actually gain from the utility of these tests or from using these tests. What are some of the things that we can do, okay, in order to generate an evidence for test utility? We can use the expectancy table, okay, or maybe even the Taylor-Russell table, okay? So using the expectancy table, usually it can be useful for tests or tools that generates a dichotomized result. Like for example, either pass, fail, capable, for example, or incapable, competent or incompetent. Okay, we would just be using this to determine whether those tests that will be identified by a test to be competent can really be competent enough when placed on a certain job or when placed in a certain competency test. Okay. On the other hand, we have the Taylor-Russell table. Okay, again for dichotomous tests, which can give us an estimate, no, how passing a certain test could actually lead us towards detecting those people who can really perform a certain task or who can really pass a certain criterion that we've established. Okay? Ayan. Next is the Naylor-Shine formula. Okay, or Naylor-Shine utility analysis procedure. Usually, it can be used for non-dichotomized this type. Tests that generates non-dichotomized results. So it could be a polytomous set of results, no? Not just competent or incompetent, but there could be certain measures in between. Okay? So that would give us an idea about how the test contributes to as to how people make the right decision about a certain individual. Like for example, in terms of industrial psychology, how a certain test contributes to the hiring decision of the human resource professional. How, for example, in the clinical setting, how a certain test contributes to the decision of the clinician whether to diagnose or not to diagnose a certain individual. Okay? Following estimate of utility is the Brogen-Cronbach-Lesser formula. Usually, it's an ROI-based or return of investment-based formula. Okay, that tries to calculate how successful we are, for example, in identifying a certain person who passes certain criterion using a particular selection instrument, test, or tool. Okay. And more encompassing utility analysis is the decision theory. This is actually how the different tests or data gathering procedures that we've administered helped us to achieve an ideal outcome so that we can produce adequate conclusions or recommendations. Okay? Yan. And those are some of the things that we may want to further explore about the different measures of test validity. I hope I was able to explain how these estimates are being established and how these things can help us claim that the tests that we are using right now or the tools that we are administering, scoring, and interpreting to our clients are not just tests, but they are standardized, objective, reliable, valid, and practical tests to administer. Thank you so much, guys, for listening. Let's talk about test development and construction on our next lecture. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe. Bye.